part 3 of the British Boxing Review. For those of you who have recently joined, or for those of you who just haven't checked it out, parts 1 and 2 went up last week and featured part 1 being my top 10 prospects in British boxing, part 2 being my top 10 contenders who I think have the greatest probability of becoming world champions. In this one, we're talking about the top 10 pound for pound currently active in British boxing. So we're going to rattle through that list, and that will conclude this 3-part mini series that I've quite enjoyed doing, actually. I hope people have enjoyed watching it. Thanks to everyone who's supported it along the way by putting it up on Twitter and hitting the thumbs up button and subscribing off the back of it. You know, much appreciated. Please keep that going. It's actually inspired me to maybe do another video looking at potential all British mega fights that can happen in 2018. So potentially we'll film that later on this week if I get time and look at some of the matchups that could potentially take place. But anyway, I digress. Let's talk about the top 10 pound for pound in British boxing. Now, as you guys know, when I'm doing pound for pound, I'm doing it on resume. You know, I'm not here including prospects who haven't yet fought anyone just because they've looked absolutely devastating. You know, those kind of guys. If you want to hear more about those type of characters, check out part 1 of this British Boxing Review that focus on prospects in the sport. This list is the elite. This is the more proven guys. This is the guys who's fought at a higher level. This is the guys with the strongest resumes, the strongest form in the book. So, going to rattle through the top 10. Before I do that, as has become the norm for this type of list, a few honourable mentions, people who didn't quite make the cut. There's actually only 4 honourable mentions for this list, so slightly briefer than some of the other videos I've done recently. Let's handle 2 of them in one. Tyson Fury and Amir Khan. Neither of them make the list. The reasons: inactivity and doubts surrounding their future activity. Fury, obviously, circa 2 years since he fought Vladimir Klitschko. Currently unlicensed, currently very much overweight with a hearing hanging over his head. Amir Khan, been inactive for I think 18 months since he last fought Canelo. Amir Khan's actually without a win for 2.5 years in the sport of boxing, and unless you're living under a rock, you'll know that Amir Khan is currently, rather than getting fit for a camp, fit in camp for a big fight, he's currently on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, Celebrities in the Jungle, whatever you want to call it, on ITV. So Amir Khan clearly inactive, got other things going on outside of boxing right now. Unclear when he's next going to participate in the sport. And for my money, he looked quite a long way off fighting condition from the clips I've seen of him on that TV program. So, you know, both Tyson Fury and Khan can come back. They're both relatively young guys. Yeah, I think Khan is 30 and Fury's in his late 20s, so I'm not writing them off by any stretch of the imagination. In terms of when they're actually boxing, I'm huge fans of both guys, and I don't think we can dispute that if they were both to become active and both to start getting wins, they've already got the form in the book which would entitle them to be considered near the very top of the UK pound for pound list. So yeah, I guess Fury and Khan ruled out based on activity, based on the fact that they're not currently boxing, and based on the fact that they're both without a notable win for 2 years plus, I guess. Terry Flanagan doesn't make the list. Flanagan, I believe, has the longest undefeated run in British boxing. He's a world champion with multiple defences. In fact, he's recently vacated that belt, so he's not currently a world champion. But I have to exclude Terry Flanagan because, as I say, this list is based on resume. If you actually ask yourself who Terry Flanagan's best wins are, I mean, seriously, drop me a comment. Who is Terry Flanagan's best win? Is it his last fight against Peter Petrov? You know, where he looked really average and got some very charitable scorecards, in my opinion. Is it his win over Derry Matthews, who he kind of outpointed in dull fashion? The same fighter who was later, you know, in his very next fight, if I recall, sparked out instantly by Ahara Davis. You know, Terry Flanagan, from a resume perspective, just really doesn't impress me. You know, there's very little substantive form there. You know, has he beaten an elite fighter in his entire career? No. Has he beaten a world-class fighter his entire career? No. Has he beaten a fringe contender? A fringe top 10 fighter? Maybe. You know, Flanagan, for me, just lacks that resume. Another one who doesn't make the list, Chris Eubank Jr. It's a similar perspective. Eubank, for what it's worth, I actually think has potentially stronger form than Flanagan. You know, Eubank's got a win over Arthur Abraham, who is at least established world level name, despite the fact that I wouldn't deny that Arthur Abraham is somewhat faded. He's also got wins like Chudinov and Spike O'Sullivan, kind of Euro level form if you want. But realistically, same reason as Flanagan. You know, I'm looking at world-class form. I'm looking at guys who've beaten top 5, top 10 fighters in their division. I'm looking at guys who've fought at genuine world title level against genuine world title defence. And for those reasons, Eubank and Flanagan miss out. Obviously, they're both guys who have some success in the sport, substantial success, and if they were to step up the level of opposition, Eubank obviously stepping up the level of opposition substantially in his very next fight against George Groves, if they were to emerge victorious against higher opposition in their next fights, these are guys who could very, very easily make the top 5, let alone the top 10. But right now, I've excluded them. So, honourable mentions done. Let's get to it. And I'm going to rattle through this quite quickly. Number 10, Kalia Fai. In terms of skills, you could make a case that he's higher than 10. In terms of resume, we're not quite there. Good win over... oh God, I've forgotten the guy's name. That's bad. Is it Concepcion? Yeah. Good win over Concepcion, who he made very, very light work of, despite the fact Concepcion's rated very highly on the world stage. Beat an undefeated fighter last time out in Soa Cedar, who admittedly looks somewhat basic, but yeah, still form in the book, and obviously an established world champion now, Kalia Fai. A lot of wolves in his division, a lot of real top class fighters in his division. We'll have to see what trajectory his future opponents and career go in, but an interesting fighter and someone who's got real upward momentum at the minute, so interested to see where they go next. And you know, when we next do this list, maybe in 6 months time, 12 months time, no reason he can't be higher than number 10. Number 9, a guy who actually should be higher on the list but isn't because of weak recent performances, if you ask me. Not weak recent performances, weak recent opponents. It's actually Lee Selby, another guy who, like Kalia Fai, in terms of skills, maybe deserves to be higher than 9. In fact, if we're going purely on skills, you could probably put Lee Selby, you know, top 3, maybe even number 1. You know, very good boxer. In terms of form in the book, he beat Evgeny Gradovets, which for me is still probably the standout piece of form. Some wins over Jonathan Barros, Eric Hunter, Montiel. Really, he's kind of not performed at that sort of top 10, top 5 level with the consistency required to be higher than number 9. So I've got Lee Selby there. Unfortunately, his next fight is against the kind of semi-unheralded Eduardo Ramirez in December. You know, I'm pleased that he's active, I'm pleased that he's getting out, I'm pleased that he would have had 3 fights in 2017, but he's 30 years old. Really, he needs to be stepping it up against world-class opposition to get maximum interest and momentum in his career. Lee Selby, I kind of feel he stagnated. I feel that it was a disaster for him leaving Eddie Hearn and going over to the States. I really don't think that move's worked well for him. His star power's gone down. Hopefully the relationship with Frank Warren gets him more exposure, gets him big fights, maybe against Josh Warrington, Carl Frampton. If so, Selby is a guy who could easily be number 1 of this list when we next go and do it. He's that good. But as I say, he's based on resume. Number 8. Another guy who's probably dropped in terms of where I would have had him historically. Kell Brook. You know, Kell Brook's got some decent form. One standout bit of form remains, and unfortunately it may be the standout bit of form that remains at the end of his career, but it's that Sean Porter win. Taking Sean Porter's undefeated record. Very good fighter, and you know, Kell Brook deserves to be there. Frankly, he's got a higher standout win for me than the likes of Selby, Fai, Eubank, Flanagan. You know, he deserves to be above those guys. Other bits and pieces of form, Senchenko, Frankie Gavin, you know, he hasn't quite got other world-class form apart from the Porter win. Could he be any higher? Potentially. It depends how you rank it. But based on the fact he's coming off back-to-back losses, based on the fact that the 2 times he's fought, you know, at pound-for-pound level in the form of Golovkin and Spence, if you like, he's actually come up a little bit short through injury and through weight classes and other factors. I couldn't actually have Kell Brook higher than 8 currently because of the back-to-back losses. Clearly a guy whose career could go in one of 2 directions right now, and a guy who I would have had probably higher up on this list before those defeats. You know, but Kell Brook right now, where we are today, November 17, I've got him at number 8. Number 7, another guy who's probably dropped down on the list from where I would have had him historically. And I will admit, you know, in reflection, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, I was maybe one of those who was slightly guilty of overhyping this character. I've got Jamie McDonald at number 7. Really good pieces of form on the road against Kamagai. You know, over 2 fights, very, very impressive wins there for Jamie McDonald. Other bits of form as well. Stuart Hall, he got the win over Liborio Solis in highly controversial circumstances last time he, well, no, time before last. Last time was a technical draw against Liborio Solis. McDonald's one of these guys who's kind of almost like a Lee Selby, lost a little bit of momentum. You know, the very uninspiring performance against Liborio Solis, the rematch which was stopped early due to cuts. You know, he's a guy who has kind of been overtaken, actually. You look, you know, a few years ago, I've got him at number 7 now, still very high. A few years ago, I might have had him at number 3 or 4. I probably would have done, actually. But, you know, whereas he's kind of stagnated ever so slightly, other guys have kind of impressed beyond him. And actually, an example of that is the guy I have directly above him, who competes in the same weight class, number 6, Ryan Burnett. You know, whilst McDonald has been tied up with rematches and technical draws, Burnett has kind of come from nowhere and not only won a world title against Lee Haskins, but also went and unified it against Zanat Zakhianov. So I actually pipped Burnett over McDonald, and it was a hard decision to make that. You know, I could have gone either way on that. But I did feel Burnett's recent form and the fact that he's, you know, got quick back-to-back wins, whereas McDonald's been relatively inactive and looked relatively unimpressive. I thought whilst they were quite similar from a resume perspective, I just sided with Ryan Burnett over that. So for me, that's my 6 and 7 explained there. And, you know, both of those guys have potential big fights. You've got Zolani Teti, who I'm sure would happily step in with either of those guys. You know, I know Paul Butler was calling out Jamie McDonald. McDonald's talking about changing up weight classes, maybe mixing it up with like a Scott Quigg, someone of that nature. You know, both of these guys have chances of increasing their ranking, but at this point, Burnett seems to be the guy with the upwards trajectory. As for Jamie McDonald, you know, I don't want to say he's come to the autumn of his career, because I think that's harsh, but certainly he's a guy who needs to do something for me, and needs to do something in relatively short order to re-establish himself at the top of this list. Moving on to number 5, top 5. I've gone for George Groves. Controversial selection because of the nature of some of his losses. The 2 losses by stoppage to Carl Frotz. But Groves has actually put together decent form. You know, come back from the stoppage losses to Frotz and the loss to Badu Jack to beat the likes of Martin Murray, Andrea De Luisa. He then won a version of the world title against Fedor Chudanov, who I thought was an underrated name. Defended it very well against Jamie Cox, stopping Cox. You know, not many people were thinking Cox would get blown out like that. Let's not also forget, George Groves has historic form, most notably the win over James DeGale. And you know what? Out of this whole pound-for-pound list, that win over James DeGale is one of the single most significant pieces of form you will find anywhere on it. You know, seriously, that is strong, strong form. I know it's historic. I know there's been losses between now and then, but it shouldn't be forgotten about. And because of that, and because of the fact that he's bounced back from his losses to win a world title, looked good doing it. You know, we know Groves is vulnerable, but he looked very powerful, very devastating against Chudanov and Cox. I thought he just about merited inclusion at number 5. Next fight against Eubank is going to determine if he goes even higher or if he swaps places perhaps with Chris Eubank, who got an honourable mention and just about missed out on this list. Let's go to the top 4. Number 4, Billy Joe Saunders. I think Billy Joe Saunders is one of the most underrated fighters from a resume perspective. You know, people don't give Billy Joe Saunders his resume the respect it deserves. On the way up, I remember he had that massive run against unbeaten fighters. John Ryder, Spike O'Sullivan, Nick Blackwell. There were other fighters than that as well, who I've temporarily forgotten. But if you go and look back on his resume, the amount of scalps that Billy Joe Saunders took on the way up. Chris Eubank Jr., you know, Chris Eubank Jr., the only loss in his career, for me, soundly outboxed by Billy Joe Saunders. Eubank's gone on to be a world level fighter. Eubank's gone on to be a guy competing in world title fights. He'll be in a world title fight in his very next fight. Billy Joe Saunders, over time, that piece of form over Eubank is looking better and better and better. But it doesn't stop there. Billy Joe Saunders then went and beat Andy Lee, who was an established world champion at the time, and has had 1 or 2 defences of his belt. Admittedly, has put in the odd subpar performance, but put in a slightly better looking performance against Willie Munro Jr. for me. And you know, Billy Joe Saunders, you know, if you actually look at his resume, beaten Eubank, beaten Andy Lee, beaten Willie Munro Jr., all sorts of other more like domestic European level names earlier on in his career. I don't think there's too many fighters with the consistency of wins that Billy Joe Saunders has. So I've gone for him at number 4. And he's a guy with an upwards trajectory. You know, now he's winning fights, getting more active, working with the Ingles. Looks like he's going to be out against David Lemieux next time up, which will maybe even be a career high in terms of form, depending on how you look at it. Billy Joe Saunders is peaking in terms of his age. He's 28. He's a guy who could make waves even higher up on this list if he continues his unbeaten record. At number 3, and let me say this, number 2 and number 3, I kind of think both of them are guys who are just about holding on to these positions and are in danger of actually slipping down. You know, these are guys who are still at the elite of British pound for pound, but it wouldn't take a hell of a lot to see them drop down substantially. Maybe not off the top 10, but drop down to the second half of the list. Number 3 is James DeGale. You know, DeGale is a guy who has kind of been a little bit forgotten about, actually. The fact that he was omitted from the World Boxing Super Series, be that out of his choice or otherwise, has kind of meant that he's flown under the radar a bit. He's fighting Caleb Truex at the Copper Box, you know, on a Frank Warren show in December. Not the kind of fight that we want in order to move him up a pound for pound list. Coming off a draw against Badu Jack, you know, that was a fight he looked very, very vulnerable in. It was the most beatable I've seen James DeGale, and you know, he's just got this little profile now where he's had that draw, to Badu Jack. He had the loss to George Groves earlier on in his career. Starting to look a bit more vulnerable, been a little bit inactive, had 1 or 2 injuries, and now coming back against Caleb Truax. He's just got that little bit of a mould of a guy who's slightly stagnating, not quite got the momentum we like to see in his career. The reason that I've got him as high as number 3, frankly, he hasn't suffered any losses. Badu Jack is a world-class fighter, probably the number 1 super middleweight in the world. At the time, he squared off against James DeGale. You know, James DeGale didn't lose to him, so I give him credit for that. There's other strong form in there. Lucien Boutte, Andre Durrell, you know, very, very good form. And despite the fact he lost to George Groves, I kind of feel that subsequent to that fight, he's won slightly more relevant fights than George Groves. I thought his wins over Durrell and Boutte were slightly stronger than wins over like Chudinov and Martin Murray and Jamie Cox. I also thought that, yeah, whilst the Badu Jack fights were close for both men, we must remember from a form perspective, Groves lost to Badu Jack, whereas DeGale drew. So I picked James DeGale, and undoubtedly one of Britain's best fighters. Let's see where he goes from here. Interesting to know if he's a guy who can hold that position, or will maybe start to, you know, unfortunately go on a downward spiral now. Not dissimilar comments from my pick at number 2, who is Carl the Jackal Frampton, who just came off a very, very, very tough fight against Horatio Garcia. You know, Frampton, for me, still deserves to be included on this list at the top. Huge, huge, huge win for Leo Santa Cruz, which propelled him to many people's global pound-for-pound list, let alone British pound-for-pound list. A win over Scott Quigg, a win that he definitely deserved based on the performance in the ring overnight. Other strong historic form, the likes of Kiko Martinez, those type of names. You know, Carl Frampton's got some class bits of form on his resume. Unfortunately, the last 2 fights haven't inspired confidence. You know, there was the reversal of form where he lost unexpectedly in the rematch against Leo Santa Cruz. He then, as I say, for me, was very, very subpar, actually, in his fight against Horatio Garcia. I've got a big post-fight video up on the channel there, so please do check it out if it's of interest. But for me, that fight gives us maybe more questions than answers as to the future of Carl Frampton, being frank. So, you know, he's a guy who I'm still including on the list. I'm still including high because I think you can't discount the relatively recent win against Leo Santa Cruz and Scott Quigg and those sort of guys. And, you know, that puts him ahead for me of the likes of Groves and Brook and DeGale, etc. But it wouldn't surprise me now if next time Frampton steps up to the elite level, be it Selby, be it Gary Russell Jr., give it that third fight perhaps against Leo Santa Cruz, if maybe the tide starts to turn and he starts to drop a few places. Let's see. Will be interesting to find out. Number 1, and you've probably worked out who number 1 is based on the fact that I haven't included him so far on the list. But number 1 has to be Tony Bet. No, I'm joking. It has to be Anthony Joshua. Why? Look, I'm going to be honest, and whether you like this or not, I've ranked him here on the base of one bit of form. But the win over Vladimir Klitschko, the knockout win of Vladimir Klitschko, for me, is probably the most substantive bit of form in British boxing. He is the one fighter on this list who you could confidently say is the number 1 fighter in their division as the consensus fighter. Could you say DeGale or Groves or Frampton or Billy Joe or Ryan Burnett or Kell Brook or Lee Selby? Could you say that they were the consensus number 1 in their division? Absolutely not. Could you say that with Anthony Joshua? Yes. Has Anthony Joshua knocked out the previous number 1 in his division? Yes. I don't actually think anyone else has done that. Now, people will be reluctant to put him as their number 1 because Klitschko was old, Klitschko was coming off a loss. But for me, the Vladimir Klitschko that Anthony Joshua beat that night was still an elite boxer, was still a pound-for-pound level boxer globally. And because of that, I've got to stick by my metal. I'm a resume guy when it comes to pound for pound. And I've got to put Anthony Joshua on the list. He does have other bits of form. You know, Carlos Takam, for me, on the peripheries of being a top 10 heavyweight. Dillian Whyte, for me, on the peripheries of being a top 10 heavyweight. You know, Joshua, clearly his strongest piece of form by miles is Vladimir Klitschko. But if you actually look at it, his wins over Takam, his wins over Brazil, his wins over Dillian Whyte, you know, that's certainly 3 wins over top 15 level opposition in the heavyweight division. Yeah, if not 3 wins over borderline top 10 fighters, depending on how you rank these things. So I think Anthony Joshua, on balance, deserves to be number 1. I think he's the guy who is the consensus top guy in his division. He's obviously a unified champion. I think he's beaten the other consensus number 1 in his division at the time of the fight. And for that reason, I've got him at the top of the list. He does lack some of the depth in resume of some of the other guys. You know, he doesn't have the number of fights against world championship level of opposition, but I do think the form he does have is the strongest, and because of that, I've got him at number 1. Look, these lists are always controversial. When you do a video as to whether fighter A will beat fighter B, you're bound to please half of the people because you're picking one of the guys. When you do a list, you're bound to please far fewer people because of the variance and because no one's going to agree with fighters in a particular order. You know, I'm sure there's people who think Chris Eubanks would be on the list. I'm sure there's people who think all sorts of things. But yeah, this is my take. I did revise this list several times. I actually started it about 3 days ago. I've mixed people up. I've had to have long talks with the wall to try and work out what order I wanted people in. I can't disagree with you if you've got it slightly different to me. Some of the form is very, very close, but that is my best effort at the top 10. Let me read it back to you. Number 10, Caliafai. 9, Lee Selby. 8, Kell Brook. 7, Jamie McDonald. 6, Ryan Burnett. 5, George Groves. Number 4, Billy Joe Saunders. 3 for James DeGale. 2 for Carl Frampton. Number 1, Anthony Joshua. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your lists if you can put the time and inclination into making a top 10. Leave your comments as ever in the section below. To support me, to support this channel, to support this video, please click the thumbs up button, get some more visibility. Please put it up on your Twitter or your Facebook. You can add me as a friend on Facebook using the link below. You can follow me on Twitter at Boxing Gossip. Most importantly, if you haven't already done so, do take the time to subscribe so you can check out all of my other stuff. Many thanks indeed for tuning in. Appreciate everyone for following my channel.